Greetings, AP Computer Science students. Here is the screencast on arrays. So I'm going to solve or write the code for a one-dimensional array problem and a two-dimensional array problem. So the one-dimensional array problem that I'm going to do is I'm going to do have 3 in coding that the coding that array to Java section. So the directions are I'm supposed to return a true or false value. Return true if 3 appears in the array exactly 3 times and no 3's are next to each other. So I'm going to have to do two things. I'm going to have to count how many 3's there are. And I'm also going to have to ensure that every 3 I find doesn't have a 3 adjacent to it. Now, the tricky thing about making sure that you don't have a 3 adjacent to it is that the first 3 in an array, I won't have to check what comes before it. In fact, if I try to, I'm going to get an out of bounds error. And the last 3 in the array, I can't check what comes after it because I'm going to get an out of bounds error. So my solution is I'm going to start at position 1 of the array. So in the examples here, the numbers in position 1 would be 1, 1, and 4. And then I'm going to have a for loop that goes to the very last element of the array. And each time through the loop, it looks at the element that it's currently working with, whose index is what the counter variable is at that moment, and it's going to look 1 in front of it. So the one in front of it is going to have an index 1 less than the one that we're looking at itself. So we'll do a comparison of those two values, and if they're true, then if they're the same, then we'll immediately return false. And if we get to the end and we have more than 3 threes, then we will also return false. And if neither of those things have happened, meaning we haven't found 2 adjacent 3's and there are fewer than 3 threes or more than 3 threes, then we'll return true. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up, let's see, I'm going to set up a sum variable that I'll do count. So I'm going to use this to keep track of how many 3's I come across. And then I'm going to write my loop. So I'm going to say int I equals 1, I less than nums dot length, and then I plus plus. So each time through the loop, I is going to be 1 bigger than it was before, and it's going to start at 1, and as long as it's less than the length of the array, it's going to continue. So the last element in the array is always 1 less than the length of the array. So that is the last value for the counter variable, meaning the last one it's going to look at is the last element in the array. Then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to say if, okay, so I'm going to look in position I of nums, and then I'm going to, first, and see if it's a 3. If it's a 3, then I want to add 1 to the variable that's keeping track of how many I've come across. And then I'm going to make sure that the one behind it is not a 3. Now you may say, what about the one in front of it, or the one forward later on in the array? Well, let that one worry for itself. If you encounter a 3 and there happens to be a 3 after it, then once you get to that one, you'll find the 3 before it. So like in this lower example, I have 3, 4, 3, 3, 4. When I get to the 4, I'm going to look and find a 3. When I get to the first 3, I'm only going to look in front of it and find that there's no 3. So that's going to pass. but that's going to let the loop continue. And when I move on to the next second 3, it's going to find the 3 in front of it and fail. So that's why I only actually have to look one direction. I don't have to look both directions. Okay, so now if nums I is 3, then I'm going to run the check to see if what comes after it or before it is also a 3. So I'm going to say if nums I minus 1 is a 3, then I want to immediately return false. So I would do return false. Okay, so if nums I is not a 3, then I just continue on my merry way, and I goes up by 1, and it looks in the next value to see if it's a 3, and then the one before it, etc. Okay, so when the loop is done, it's going, if it reaches the end, it means that there have been no 3s beside each other. However, the last thing I want to check is if their count has been increased to 3, because that would indicate that there were exactly 3 3s. So I'm going to say if count equals 3, then I'm going to return true. If count was not 3, meaning there were not exactly 3 3s, then I'm going to return false. Because although there were no adjacent 3s, there were more or fewer than 3 of 3s altogether. So I'm going to say return, I could either say else return false or just return false. All right, you may say, what if the array has 1 or fewer characters? What's going to happen then? Well, it turns out the loop is never going to execute if there are 1 or fewer characters, because if the length of nums is 1, my for loop is going to say for in I equals 1, I less than 1, I plus plus. Well, the loop is only going to begin to execute if the first value makes this a true statement, which it will not. 1 is not less than 1. So consequently, none of this will execute. We won't have to worry about an out of bounds error. We already gave count a value of 0, so count is not 3. So although there are no adjacent 3s, there won't be 3 of them, so it's going to return false. All right, so hopefully I got this right. Let's see. All right, after running it, I figured out what the oversight that I made. So if you look at, I don't know if you can see them or not because I'm only recording a portion of the screen, but you're going to find out that it doesn't, the way I wrote it, it's not going to count the very first 3. Because remember how we're starting at 1 and we're checking to see if nums I is equal to 3? Well, I never check to see if num 0 is equal to 3. If num 0 is equal to 3, my code does not count it. So that means I need to add another if statement that's going to check to see if nums 0 is equal to 3. And if it is, I'm going to do count plus plus. All right, and let's hope this works. All right, and other tests failing. What might those other tests be? Okay, it's failing other tests, and I'm thinking it's because I need to immediately return false if the length of nums is 0. Because if the length of nums is 0, then this is going to produce an out of bounds error. And by looking at the examples, it shows all of the examples where we have an array whose length is 1 or more pass. It just gives me a generic other tests fail. Not too helpful, but I think that might be the problem. So let me say if let me add a statement if nums.length equals 0, then I'm going to return false. And now I think I'm going to go through and get rid of all the curly braces that I don't need, because most of these if and loop conditional statements and loops only have one statement that's a part of their body, so I don't actually need. I think I can do this entire thing with just one set of curly braces inside the method, and it would be that. Okay. Yep, that was it. It was nums.length equals 0, return false. Okay, all correct. Okay, so that's the first one, and now I'm going to attempt a two-dimensional array problem that is going to be very similar to this one. In fact, I'm going to modify this problem so that to do something similar. So let's say we're given a 2D array of at least 3 rows and at least 3 columns. Okay, and I'm going to return true if the array contains at least 3 threes. Now, let's say exactly 3 threes. Okay, and none of the threes that aren't on the border of the array, the borders of the array, have any 3 that is adjacent to them on any of the 8 let's see, yes, 8 sides. So if I have a two-dimensional array, an element could possibly have 8 elements around it that that border it. To keep it simple, I'm going to say we're not going to worry about the 3s that are, in column 0, the very right-hand column, the top row, or the bottom row. So every 3 that we check is going to be 1 on the inside, and for anything that's adjacent to it in any of the 8 directions. So I just made up this problem. I hope it's not too complicated. I actually think it might be now that I'm thinking about it. So I'm going to just modify my code here, and I'm just going to type in what I think would be the solution to my problem. So the first thing I would do is I would probably run a check to make sure that the array has exactly 3 threes in it. So to do that, I'm going to just do my traditional nested for loops. So I'm going to say int row equals 0, row less than nums.length, and row plus plus. Okay, and then inside there I'm going to say for int call equals 0, call less than nums bracket 0 dot length, call plus plus. And now I'm counting. So typically when you're counting, you will want to have declared a count variable that you set equal to 0, and then every time you find what you're looking for, you increase it by 1. So I'm going to say if nums row call equals 3, then count plus plus. Okay, so once these, and I don't actually need these curly braces here because that if statement is just one statement inside the inner for loops. So I'm going to get rid of them. Okay, and now once that code is executed, I'm going to know how many threes there are. So I'm going to say if count not equal to 3, meaning there are not 3 threes, then immediately return false. Okay, so now if I get this far, if the code keeps executing past the return false statement, it means that there are 3 threes, because otherwise it would have ended. So now I want to go through and check all the internal threes in inside the array. Okay, so now if you think about it, so let me see. Let me just do a quick example here. I'm going to open Excel, which has a ready-made matrix because we have grids in Excel. So let naturally occurring grids. So let me open that, and okay, blank workbook. Cancel. Let me make the sides be the same as roughly the same, so we have something that looks kind of square. All right, so I'm going to put a border around these so I can kind of imagine my array here, and then I'm going to make the fill be solid on all sides so that it really looks like I have a two-dimensional array here. Okay, so these ones in the middle here are going to be the ones that I need to check to make sure that there are no threes on any side of any 3 that exists. So if any of these ones here are 3s, I need to make sure that there are no 3s. Like, for example, if we would find a 3 here, we'd want to make sure that this does not contain a 3, this one, neither this one, this one, this one, that one, or that one. None of those are 3. So I'm going to do I'm going to do nested for loops, but instead of starting at row 0 and ending at row, well, actually, let's pretend this was 0, 1, 2, 3. Instead of doing for int I equals 0, I less than my array.length, I plus plus, and then for instead of doing that 0 to the length of the array, I'm going to only look at rows 1 to 1 rows 1 less than the length of the array. And then for the columns, instead of doing col equals 0, col less than nums 0.length, col plus plus, I'm going to do col equals 1, col less than nums 0.length minus 1. So that effect, as a result, that will exclude the first and last row and the first and last column from consideration. So I'm going to say, okay, for int row equals 0, row equals 1, row less than nums.length minus 1, and row plus plus, and inside there I'm going to say for int col equals 1, col less than nums bracket 0.length, col plus plus. So every element that comes across inside this loop is one of the ones that I want to see if it's a 3 or not. So I'm going to say if nums bracket row col is a 3, then I need to run my check to see if all of the ones on all sides of it, none of those other 8 elements are 3. So the ones on the far left hand edge, the vertical 3 that are going to be beside it to the left, they're all going to have a row of row minus 1. No, I'm sorry, they're all going to have a column of column minus 1. So I'm gonna make a big or statement where I list them. So the first ones are going to be, let's see I find a 3 in this position right here. Then that would mean I need to check this one, that one, that one. All right, so those first 3 all have the same column, and it's col -1. Okay, so I would check to see if nums, okay, so the row above it is going to be the one above it to the left is going to be row -1, and then col -1 is equal to 3, or uh, or then the next one would be nums. So the next one would be nums, the one that's in the same row as it, but is immediately to its left. So, which would be that one. Or the next one is going to be the one that's one row below it and one to the left. And that's going to be row +1 and col -1. So if that's equal to 3, and now I need to do the other 3. So the one directly above it is going to be, that's straight above it, is going to be nums. It's going to be one row less than it and the same column. Then the one below it is going to be nums row +1 and the same column. And now I need to do the 3 that are to the right of it. So the ones to the right of it, there's 3 of them. One's going to be nums, and the first one is to the upper right of it, and that is going to be row, let's see, it's going to be row -1, and then col +1. Then I'm going to have the one that's in the same row as it, but it's one column to the right. And then lastly, I'm going to have the one that's to the southeast, which would be the row after the one that it's on. And so it's going to be col +1. So if either of those is true, now I made the problem such that we're not considering the ones on the border, so that every one that encounters in here, every time it finds a nums row col, we will know automatically that there are elements on all 8 sides of it. So, and I did that on purpose because otherwise it would be pretty complicated, only because you'd have to look at different, you'd have to limit the number of sides you check for ones that are in the first and last rows, or the first column and the last column. So if any of that is true, I immediately return false. Okay, and then if if I make it past that final test, it means that I have 3 3s, and none of those 3s have a 3 beside them, and then I would just return true. So unfortunately, since this is a two-dimensional array problem that I just made up, I can't check it here in CodingPad. Be nice if you could, but and if CodingPad had two-dimensional array problems, but since it doesn't, we're just going to have to assume that I haven't made any errors aside from a closed parenthesis there. So, all right, hope that was helpful. The only other thing that I would want you to know is how to use an enhanced for loop. So if you have a one-dimensional array, you're going to say, for example, if I have an array of ints and I want to go through each element in that array and reference each element by an enhanced for loop or for each loop, I would say, okay, for each int element in my array, whatever my array is, let's say, just say it's like the previous problem, I would say I would write nums, and then I would say, okay, if element, so the word element now would replace something like nums bracket I, if I was using a for each loop. And that way I wouldn't have to have the bracket notation. I wouldn't have to have a counter variable. I still set up a for loop. It's the enhanced for loop. And notice that element could be, as I think I've gone over, could be named anything at all. I could say pig or goat or cloud. I just use element because I think it kind of makes sense. Now let's say I had a two-dimensional array nums and I wanted to go through each element in the array. Well, in a two-dimensional array, each row is an array of ints. So I'm going to say for each int, and I'll just call it row in the two-dimensional array nums, and then inside there the inner loop is going to be for each. Okay, so now I have ints in each column of each row. So I'm going to say for each int element in each row. Okay, then I will say, instead of saying nums bracket I bracket j, or as in, or nums row call, I can just say element. So that simplifies the syntax quite a bit with two-dimensional arrays. And as I said, the for each loop has limited use because you can only go through one at a time. You can't skip over any elements of the array, and you can't reference their position relative to others. So like I couldn't do this in a for each loop where I'm referencing the positions of other elements in that same array relative to whatever one I'm looking at. So, and finally, you can't make any modifications to the array in a for each loop. All right, I hope that was helpful, and we'll see you tomorrow, and get a good night's sleep. Cheers.